Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Charlie Guthrie. I'm from AIS Training and Survivex, a GWO training provider in Newcastle and Aberdeen in the United Kingdom. We're one of the largest providers of GWO training. About 1 in 4 of the wind techs in the UK come through one of our training centres to get trained. You'll know this is part of a series of webinars. We're coming to the end of that run of webinars now. This week we've been talking to Atlas professionals, Samuel Knight International. We've had Windhoist and Halliburton from a variety of different industries. We've got one more after this at 3 p.m. today in UK time. We're going to be talking to Wood, one of the world's largest engineering businesses, one of our biggest clients and a big employer of offshore workforce in the North Sea and around the world. So it's not too late to register for that. You can register via survivex.com or training.aisgroup.co.uk. Navigate to either of our websites, its news pages, and you can register there. As we come to the end of this run of webinars, today we're with GWO, the awarding body for wind technicians around the world. I'm here with Ralph Savage, Director of Development for GWO. Today's going to be much more of a two-way discussion, and I'd like to involve you in that as well. So we're going to talk about what GWO is, what the courses are, how you go about doing the courses, and a bit about what we're seeing in the wind industry in terms of technicians, the growth in numbers of technicians. It is interactive, as I say, so at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. So if you click on that, you can pose whatever questions you want, and we'll take some as we go through the webinar, and we'll take a bunch at the end of the webinar as well. It's worth noting that we always ask for a copy of the video or a copy of the question and answers. So at the end of our run of webinars, so hopefully tomorrow or at some point very early next week, we'll email everybody that was registered for this webinar a copy of the video and a copy of the question and answers that we've got as well. So look out for that coming. But without further ado, I'm here with Ralph Savage. And Ralph, do you want to kick off? Do you want to tell us just a bit about GWO and what GWO is all about?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for the invitation, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. So Global Wind Organization is a not-for-profit body that was created by the wind industry itself. So about 8 years ago, 3 or 4 of the largest manufacturers and a couple of the largest owner-operators of wind farms grouped together in the acknowledgement that they all required their workforce to carry out basic safety training. And most of them at the time were doing broadly the same thing, but they realized that it was no competitive advantage to them to have an individual version of a first aid course at, say, Siemens Gamesa or Vestas, when they really just need those employees to understand the risks that they're going to face working on a wind turbine and carry out basically the same first aid needs and look after each other in that kind of way. So they created the first basic safety training standard in 2012. And fast forward to 2021, we've now created several more training standards based on that original idea, which is that if there's no reason to have a different training between one company and another, why not standardize what's carried out between them? And the companies themselves can recognize a GWO training course as long as it's been provided by a company like AIS, who are certified according to the requirements that our members through us create and the framework that we're responsible for.
Great. So it's very much about allowing free movement of personnel between companies, you know, rather than a certificate for one company, get a job with a different one, or you have to get theirs, different job, etc. Exactly.
Yeah. These are generic skills that are required as a baseline minimum by all large employers in the wind power industry.
Yeah. And so what sort of employers are we talking about here? Who are the kind of the founding members, in inverted commas, of GWO?
Yeah, so back in 2012, those founding members, I wasn't there myself at the time, but they were the large OEMs. So what became Siemens Gamesa, Vestas, GE, and also Ørsted, which at the time would have been known as Dong, and 1 or 2 other sort of North Sea offshore owner-operators, also quite a lot of Spanish businesses, so Acciona Energía, which is a large owner-operator with facilities all around the world. So since then, it's become a truly sort of global membership body. So we've got 4 very large Chinese companies, 1 or 2 North American-based businesses, to a total of 18 member companies. And they have to satisfy a minimum entry requirement to become a member. They have to be a large employer. So they've either got to have 1,000 employees working in wind, or they've got to have a minimum of 1 gigawatt of installed capacity. Okay, so the members we're talking about here are employing tens of thousands of people between them around the world. Yeah. So what's GWO's remit? You know, is GWO writing the materials? Is it deciding what goes into courses? What does that sit with the membership? Well, to an extent we are, because we have a team of training developers who mostly come from industry, who have worked in training and operations within the wind power sector. So they're familiar with how training matrices at large employers are designed. And the membership itself works through various committees at GWO. So the training committee meets on a very frequent basis, fortnightly or monthly. And through us, they prioritize risks and hazards that technicians face when they work in a wind turbine environment. So they have a dynamic list of what the current risks and hazards that are faced by people working in that environment, and they design training where necessary if it's going to mitigate those risks. So if a particular type of activity is causing more injuries, then if it's possible to create or adjust the training that goes into GWO courses, then it will be done. So an example of how that ends up looking is that the basic safety training standard, which is the most commonly taken training course, is now on version 13, having been updated that many times in relation to the statistics that come back from employers in terms of what kinds of things may be causing injuries and what kinds of hazards might be changing as the industry develops. Right. So what we're actually seeing is a different approach than maybe we do in other sectors, whereby in wind, it's very much like you use the term dynamic. So it's taking a standard and then just always just changing and updating that standard in almost direct relation to the risks and any incidents that do occur. So precisely, we often discuss wind, and particularly I know if the media is discussing wind, they're talking about offshore wind. How does that balance with onshore wind? You know, GWO is still applicable for onshore wind. Yeah, very much so. So, I mean, the offshore wind industry itself is a fraction of the size of the onshore wind industry globally. So the majority of OEMs are selling a lot more onshore wind turbines than they are offshore wind turbines for obvious reasons. But things are changing slowly. And as we all know, the offshore sector, particularly on the coast, on the North Sea coast, is growing really, really quickly. Nevertheless, the basic safety training skills in particular that you need are 80% the same onshore and offshore. The only unique basic safety skills that are added are the sea survival elements. So how to transfer from a boat to the transition piece at the base of a turbine on an offshore turbine is obviously unique to that environment. So you wouldn't be asked to do that if you're not going to go and work offshore. Yeah. Although in the UK, if we've had as much rain as we have lately, then sea survival might be relevant onshore as well. Perhaps, yeah. So that leads us on quite nicely to kind of the growth in the market, because you mentioned the UK, you mentioned the northeast coast we've got here. So we've got Dogger Bank, the world's biggest offshore wind farm. That came off the back of Hornsea 1, I think, as well, which before that was the biggest. I know in the UK as well, we had the first offshore wind farm, which is off Blythe, also northeast coast. So in terms of the UK, and we've got a balance of British people on this webinar, but also international. But as far as the UK is concerned, it's been doing very well, should we say, in the wind sector. And I think some of the numbers are reflecting that, because I know GWO produce a half yearly and annual look at the trajectory. What are you seeing in terms of growth in wind personnel? So we monitor the number of people who complete GWO training, and we also monitor the types of training that they receive. So Basic safety training is the entry-level minimum requirement, so most people will complete that. But as of the end of 2020, it was the number of people globally that had received or had a valid GWO training certificate, which is what we refer to as the GWO trained workforce, was approaching 100,000 people. So in the UK, my estimate is around 16 to 17,000 people have a GWO valid certificate or had one at the end of 2020. So it's proportionately speaking the biggest market for GWO training, historically, because of its connection. You know, a lot of the founding fathers of the standardization movement that I'm a part of were British QHSE experts from businesses like Erstal and Vattenfall and SSE and other owner operators who have helped develop the offshore and onshore wind industry there.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that growth continue as well. I don't think, you know, the 16, 17,000 is the start of where we are, and I think that's an early days, and we'll see that trajectory going up. We see announcements all the time from different governments, the US most recently, about the intended growth of wind. There was the publication GWO led on that put the figure at about 2.3 people from memory per gigawatt of installed power. And so if we take all our global markets and multiply that up by the number of people that would require, it's substantially more than 100,000. So
yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, we're anticipating. It's difficult to put a finger on the number of people that are in scope for GWO training. The standard itself has not been adopted in every single market around the world. So my role ultimately is to work on behalf of the largest members, the largest manufacturers, to make sure that this basic minimum standard of safety training and technical training is adopted where it can be in every market around the world. So we're targeting a doubling of that number by the end of next year. So we'd like to see 200,000 people with a GWO certificate. Great,
we'll try and facilitate that. And I think what struck me from webinars earlier in the week, we talked to Windhoist, one of the big installers of wind turbines, certainly in UK, Ireland and European markets, as well as Samuel Knight, who's a specialist. They were talking about where some of the people were coming from. You know, if it was me, I'd have taken a guess that they'd have been ex-military, they could have come from oil and gas or the petrochemical sector. But they were talking very much about, they were talking agriculture, electricians, sparkies, almost plumbers. It was amazing kind of the breadth of people that are drawn. And what they were saying is they're getting into the industry because they've got the core skills. You know, we've talked about BSc a few times already, but you know, you're an electrician, maybe with some high voltage experience. So you're coming with the core skills. All the GWO accreditation is doing is adding on the safety site specific skills.
Yeah, and that's true. And I mean, I speak to a lot of people who are involved in bringing workforces in to facilitate installation on a really, really large scale. And the thing that they're looking for is people with pre-existing skill sets. So, I mean, starting with just people that had come from the military, those are obviously going to be great, very skilled people who have a solid understanding of working in an environment where health and safety is really important. But similarly, all sorts of different manufacturing industries, all sorts of other energy sectors, you name it. There's going to be interest from the wind power sector in bringing people in who have lots of experience of working in those kinds of technologies. The one thing that they will ask them to accept is that there are some basic minimum standards that those people won't necessarily have experienced. They won't necessarily have worked in a wind turbine environment, so they need to spend some time familiarizing themselves with that.
Yeah. And you know, we're talking here about a lot of the positive numbers, you know, 100,000 people coming into the sector, which would possibly automatically lead people to say, is it a sector that's being flooded with green, new to the industry technicians? Is there an inherent risk there with a disproportionate ratio of experienced versus inexperienced technicians? But I suppose the answer is the demand from those operators and the installation teams is that they need more new blood coming into this industry.
Yeah, Yeah, like any growth industry, finding skilled people is a really, really big challenge. And the amount of inward investment that's coming from corporate finance and the fact that the oil and gas industry itself and the large oil and gas owners are moving more into renewables means that those businesses are going to be reskilling their own people as well, I think, to work in a renewables sector, whether it's solar or wind or any other type.
Yeah. And just to cover off, I can't now think, it's John's question, John, if you're still listening, is to say that when we talked to Wind Toys yesterday, they said they almost have a policy of Jan, Feb, March, they'll be taking on experienced wind technicians for some of their main roles. But then come Easter onwards, they primarily look at bringing new people in at a trainee level. So they've got their GWO certs, but they don't have experience, and they can buddy them up with the experienced techs to accelerate that experience. Where are you seeing the growth? So we've talked UK being a sort of significant part of the overall, but which markets are really accelerating at the moment?
Well, some of them naturally accelerating. So a really good example is Taiwan. Taiwan is, if you don't know, it's an island off the coast of China, and they have a target, I think, of 5.4 gigawatts of installed capacity in the next 4 years, which is kind of 2 Dogger banks worth of wind power. And from the point of view of our involvement in it, 3 large training centers, one of which used to be it's a technical university, so they teach lots of mariners in STCW and other safety courses. Those have quickly got up to speed, and I think they're now training around about 2,000 technicians, and they've managed to get that up to speed within about 18 months. So that's a real kind of beacon of how that commitment can take place, and it's also an international cooperation between manufacturers and owner operators from Europe, and also investors in local marketplaces too. Continental markets, the size, you've mentioned North America. There's going to be a huge amount of offshore wind development in North America off the eastern seaboard in the next 10 years. And we spend a lot of time with our members in North America, helping them to support local training infrastructure. So that would be maritime colleges in particular, where they used to, as I said, train mariners to get up to speed on training people to work in a wind turbine environment. So that's going to be an interesting story in the next few years.
Yeah, and what we're seeing, so COVID aside, what we're seeing is the UK workforce becoming a real export market in skills. Particularly America are taking along a lot of British workforce. Countries around Europe really are taking on a lot of the British workforce. Now the entry requirements to get into America and such has pretty much stopped that in its tracks. But I feel that a lot of the clients that we have talk about that and don't think that's ever going to go away. They see the British market as a basis for this experience that they can bring in and just allow us to upskill some of their own personnel. Because like you say, America is going to be a very big market for this. If we think what the UK is putting together and the size of the opportunity in America, it's a big opportunity. Let's talk a little bit about courses in a bit more detail. There's a lot of the audience at the moment will be either in wind, but maybe a bit new, or brand new to wind. And when we even talk BST, might not know what we're talking about. So let's start with that. So can you tell us a bit about BST? What is it? How long does it last for?
Yeah. You'd probably be equally, if not better than me at explaining this, seeing as you deliver the courses. But BST stands for Basic Safety Training, and it consists of 4 modules plus the sea survival module if your employer requires you to go offshore. So the 4 core modules are the ones that you would do regardless if you're going to work in an onshore wind turbine or an offshore wind turbine. So they take around about a week to complete. Some of them are longer than others. So the more intensive ones are the working at heights, which is how you learn to use sliders and how you learn how to work safely at height. using and learning about all of the different kinds of PPE equipment that are required in that role, and that's a 2-day course. There's a first aid course, which is very specifically designed for a wind turbine environment, and that's also a 2-day course, which is considerably more intense than a typical kind of Red Cross first aid course, for example. So, and then finally, there's fire awareness and manual handling. And all of these modules are designed to teach you and to understand to build a knowledge base and to learn some skills so that you can avoid the major risks and hazards that you'll face in a wind turbine environment. So the better training that you receive will resemble the experience that you're going to have. So, a first aid crisis or the exercises in a manual handling course will teach you about the ways to avoid injury, ultimately, when you're dealing with, winching heavy equipment around the inside of a nacelle, for example.
Yeah, and what we've been talking about a lot recently is the difference in trainings that we see, or sorry, I shouldn't say training, but the difference in sight. There's a lot of comparisons between what the military do when they're in very remote places, what an offshore oil and gas worker does when he's on an oil platform, what you do on a wind turbine. And the fundamental difference that on a wind turbine, you've got 4 or 5 people there total, whereas on an oil and gas platform, you might have 200, 250 if it's a big platform. So that's why when we're talking to our first aid delegates, for instance, first aid's so much more crucial in wind, because if someone has an accident on a wind turbine, you've got to wait for a medical team to arrive. You haven't just got a doctor on an oil and gas platform or a medic out in the field. So therefore, it's down to you're one of 4 or 5 people to.
Yeah, and it's quite a sobering thought, really, when you think about it. If you were an experienced technician and you were asked to go and work on a job to go and carry out some maintenance, and you may be assigned that role with someone you've never worked with before, and you'd be working in a team of 2. You'd want them to have the same level of skill that you've got in case it was you that was injured, and that's the purpose of having a standard that we all recognize.
Yeah, exactly that. And I mean, even we talk about sea survival a lot, and sea survival in wind turbine territory is vastly different from getting to an offshore oil and gas installation where, typically it's a helicopter transfer, because we will regularly have delegates that will compare the two. And I think, was it 15% similarity between the two?
Well, with the typical oil and gas sea survival training, the similarity kind of ends in the name almost, because the reality is that the biggest risks that you face in an offshore environment that our members have discovered is the transfer between the boat and the transition piece. And the majority of the work in the sea survival training course, therefore, is to avoid the risk of injury in that process. You might think it's going to be 100% about learning how to survive in water and deal with hypothermia risk and things like that. While that is important, it's actually the safety elements of transferring from a boat to a transition piece with all of your equipment, often with your colleagues as well. And that is an activity that can be particularly dangerous. All you have to think about is the potential swell in the amount of height that you gain or lose when you're trying to go from the boat to the ladder.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. And so just to kind of summarize our BST, so it's about a week-long course. If you're coming into the industry, that's really the very first step you take. Generally, we find that employers wouldn't fund that. Some employers will fund some of the later courses, but you self-fund the BST module. They last for 2 years. So at some point within that 2-year time frame, a month, couple of months from the end, you then take a refresher course. Those refreshers are slightly shorter in length, therefore slightly cheaper, working on the basis that you are literally just taking skills that you now fundamentally have, and it's just keeping your competency up to date with those. Onto the wider standards now. So when someone looks at, for instance, GWO's website, and they look at the range of courses that are delivered, that's accelerated from just GWO basic safety training up to include a host of others. And I guess that's been driven by the membership that have said, look, we endorse GWO training, and therefore within the GWO portfolio, this is what we want. Really, why what's the reasoning behind that? Why do GWO expand their portfolio of courses? Why don't you just sit at the basic safety training and not the wider training?
It's because of an ambition that the members have that I mentioned right at the top of the webinar, really, which is that where they see a chance to create a standard that they'll all accept, that they'll all use, that they already do perhaps a version of themselves, they would prefer for a standard to be available so that quality controlled independent training providers can deliver it on their behalf, locally to where courses are, to where the workplace is going to be. Because while most of these large employers employ thousands of people and they do have their own internal training infrastructure, they certainly don't have training infrastructure that's able to, Vestas is operating in 81 countries around the world. It doesn't necessarily have that ability to be able to put in place a standardized training facility in all of those different places. So it's simple economics, but also a commitment to making sure that there's a good standard of safety.
Yeah, and I guess, so the other main section of course that I was going to cover off this morning was the basic technical training, the BTT, made up of, this is going to put me on the spot, hydraulics, mechanical, electrical, and one other. Installation, thank you, Ralph. So generally what we see from employers amongst anything else is you start with your BST, and really the BTT, this basic technical training, is the next in line that most people go from. And I guess that's where that has come from. It's saying, look, all these different employers have different standards of technical training. Let's bring that all into one standard. And from experience, that's probably one of the more difficult ones to get together, because different employers had different ideas of what they wanted to see included in those. Yeah,
I mean, and the more complex the activities, the harder it is to create training standards, but that doesn't necessarily make it not worth doing. So the basic technical training standards also take about a week to complete if you do all of the modules, and they are fundamentally about safety. Everything we do, all of our training standards are about learning to carry out a task in a safe way. So if you take the basic technical training mechanical module, within that course you'll learn particular learning elements around bolts, torque and tensioning, which is learning how to safely use the tools and understand the fundamentals of those activities, because you're working with huge pieces of equipment and there can be some significant risks of injuries if you do things wrong. If you over tighten one of these bolts, it can cause some serious incidents. And likewise for the hydraulic module, working with hydraulic systems has some entry level understanding that you need to familiarize yourself with. And it may be that you already have some experience of working with hydraulics in another sector, but this will be again focused on what those risks are when you're in a wind turbine. So it may be that you come there with some preconceived ideas about how these things are going to look, but spend a day learning about what they're like in a wind turbine. And in the case of the basic technical training standard, the fundamental difference is that there is no refresher, it's a one-off. And the reason for that is because as a wind turbine technician, you'll probably go into work the next day and start using all of those skills on a daily basis. Therefore, you don't really need to refresh the training. Whereas with a first aid course, hopefully you won't have to use any of those skills because no incidents will ever happen and you won't have to rescue anybody. But after 2 years, having not done anything, having not carried out CPR, having not carried out an initial inspection of an injury, it's worth refreshing those skills so that you feel comfortable, and you can also be reassured that your colleagues feel comfortable in their knowledge and their skills.
We're getting close to the end. We've probably got time for a couple of quick ones. It'll mean we'll run over by a couple of minutes, but there's been some good questions coming in. We've talked about the oil and gas versus wind. There's been quite a few people asking about those trainings, as probably we expected. We've got Luca asking, so it's a follow-on from what you were just saying there. Lucas says, what's the rationale behind every 2 years rather than refreshing, say, every 3 years or every 4 years?
Well, it's an open discussion and everything we do is dynamic. So at the moment, it is 2 years and there are quite a few inputs into that decision. And we have a publication on our website, which maybe Charlie can share with you after this. It might be useful for you to read through. There's a lot of academic research into skills fade and knowledge fade. So it's a little bit like the example I mentioned about the first aid knowledge and skills. But the members look at all of the evidence in terms of how quickly knowledge and skills are retained in the memory if they're not used. And the, with an abundance of caution, as most of our members have, they stick to the 2-year refresher cycle in the absence of the industry carrying out, for example, drills like you would carry out in an oil and gas environment or in the shipping industry where they do fire drills and first aid drills and all sorts of other things. And that informs their industry's safety training standards refresher cycles, so they're longer. But nevertheless, the wind industry is learning all the time, and this topic is certainly one that is not it's not fixed in time. But at the moment, all the evidence says that the 2-year refresher cycle is the most sensible way to go in order to maintain a lower injury record.
Yeah, and that training versus drills and stuff is probably one of the key elements to that. And I will, so when we drop the video and the notes across to people at, like I said, the end of this week or the start of next week, I'll include that document in there as a link. And so the last question is very relevant to a lot of people here, and it's how do we get into wind? So very, very relevant for people looking to get in. I know that we produced, as AIS and Survivex, we produced a guide to the wind industry. So that's available through our website and is a complete package of who the employers are, what skills are needed, what areas are recruiting. And I guess from you, Ralph, the advice is employers. So GWO website, list of who the membership bodies are. That will give you a target list of who the big employers are, like you say, tens of thousands of people between them. I think from our point of view, our advice is, LinkedIn, careers pages, and following those. I don't know if there's anything you can add to that, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that GWO members represent a tip of the iceberg as well. So if you take one example of a big owner operator from our membership I was talking to yesterday, they're directly responsible for 1,300 people for all of their current installation and operational work. But they're indirectly responsible for 20,000 other people who are in their supply chain. So that will be engineering firms, anybody who is involved at any stage in the installation or operation and maintenance of the assets that they've got. And there's an increasingly large number of very big service providers, companies like Global Wind Service, who themselves employ thousands of technicians who are deployed all around. There's other companies like Fairwind who operate in a similar kind of way. So the industry is growing and developing. There's a lot of specialist and generalist engineering companies that have moved or moving over from the oil and gas sector as well. So
yeah, a big supply chain that sits behind it.
Yeah, it's huge.
So I think to summarize that question, you would start with your training. So we talked at the head of this webinar really about the basic safety training week-long module. You can find out where you can do that training through GWO's website. If you're anywhere in the world, that'll give you a list of training providers. Of course, if you're in the UK, we've got our base in Newcastle and in Aberdeen where you can complete that. Then there's a series of bonus courses. Some of the employers refer to them as bonus courses. So your enhanced first aid, your advanced rescue training, advanced hub rescue, skills that in a different environment you'd have people dedicated to, but in the wind sector, you're multi-skilled across both. And then you have some of the skills training with Slinger Signaler we haven't really talked about today and have kind of run out of time for. Blade rescue is blade repair is a big opportunity. And then in terms of getting the employment, we look at the employers. We look, like you were just saying then, at the supply chain, their websites, their LinkedIn channels. LinkedIn's a big forum for people talking about wind sectors. And we also see people on our courses, networking on our courses. There'll be someone that says, hey, I was on a refresher course with the operations manager for X company. and they can provide introductions for you as well. So I think that kind of answers the how to get jobs. I think at the head of this webinar, it seems very clear that the trajectory for growth in jobs is only going to go upwards with investment, financial and otherwise, from governments. So I think things are looking positive for the wind sector. Have you got any closing remarks?
No, I mean, I'd echo all of that and say that the wind industry is a good place to be. It needs skilled workers. In some cases, there are, entry-level requirements, and the reason that our training standards exist is to give guidance on what you will have to bring with you, or what they will require you to have before they even let you near a wind turbine. But as we've said repeatedly, the industry probably has more opportunities than its current workforce can accommodate. So that's what they're looking to meet that challenge.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time, Ralph. To our audience, I know we've run slightly over time there, but I thought it was valuable to include more of that content. We have got the webinar with Wood at 3 p.m. this afternoon. It's not too late to register that via our website. You can also visit our AIS Training website for that wind guide I referred to. So there is a sectors page and a sector for winds there. Like I said, summary video and a summary of the question and answers and those documents that we've referred to during the webinar we'll send across to people later on this week or early next week. But in the meantime, all that's left to say is thank you very much, Ralph.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for having me. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.